which I often have to explain because I have a PhD in social work, and they're like, social work? Climate change? What do you do? The issue is that climate change is radically restructuring economies, the environment. That means livelihoods. And we're also seeing a greater frequency and severity of extreme weather and disasters. I actually have a disaster management background before I went for my PhD at Columbia. I worked for many years as an NGO humanitarian relief program manager around the world. The tsunami and the Balkans and Afghanistan and all those fun places. So I have a disaster management background, and that's how I came into climate change. And have been primarily working on climate change for the past 2 years. And this was an interesting study. We still have no idea why they funded it, but the Danish military wanted a study on human rights and climate change. So we went, okay, Danish military. Here's to funding. we were really confused. So, but it's actually a really interesting and important question, because what's going on is, can I ask first of all, are you students or researchers or, like NGO workers? So I can pitch this talk a little bit differently.
NGO worker.
NGO worker? I remember you, I know you. I've met you before.
Oh.
Yeah, which NGO are you with?
I work for a German organization called Communitybased.
Which one?
German Agro-Action.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, but your face is same.
Yeah, I was like, I know you from somewhere.
I hope not from Denmark, because I used to study in Denmark.
Uh-oh. And are you all researchers, or?
I'm an intern at the EU delegation.
Okay.
With the Natural Resource Management Center.
Great, okay. And Deppy's NGO, Isidro's NGO.
I'm NGO and a student.
Okay, and a student also?
FAO.
FAO?
And researcher.
Yeah.
Education.
Okay.
You can pitch it research.
All right, researcher, okay. So, part of it is a lot of the international NGOs and also many of the local NGOs are increasingly adopting various cross-cutting themes, right? Gender, child protection, inclusive development. We have a number of them. And climate change and human rights are both frequently adopted and increasingly adopted as cross-cutting themes. But there's a lot of muddle as to what that actually means sometimes, particularly when you put in, it's one thing to say, okay, we have an agriculture program and we're going to mainstream climate change perspectives into it. But if you start doing rights-based approaches to climate change, it gets a little confusing. Like this study was done with a Danish research consulting company that does a lot of work for Scandinavian donors, the Nordic Development Fund, CEDA, Danida. And they're getting more and more proposals in with these grandiose rhetoric statements of the rights-based climate change, human rights, blah, blah, blah. And it's actually very unclear what that means. And I think some growing concern that it's not meaning a whole lot, but buzzwords that are coming into proposals. So it was like, let's take a step back and explore what rights-based approaches mean and whether and how they're practiced. And they did 2 case studies, one on Cambodia, which I was part of, and also Kenya. So if you see our full report, it covers Cambodia and Kenya and compares them. And I wanted to cover 2 really basic approaches to climate change programming, because I know Human Science Encounters Phnom-Penh is primarily social research network, and not everybody knows all the climate change jargon. There is adaptation and mitigation, and those are sort of the 2 pillars of programming. Mitigation is the one that people are usually more familiar with. It seeks to reduce the extent or the speed of climate change by reducing greenhouse gases. Turn off the light, get a green, energy refrigerator, walk instead of driving your moto everywhere. It's reducing greenhouse gases through green energy, but also through environmental conservation, particularly forests, because forests absorb these greenhouse gases and take them out of the air. And so that's what I think, at least I'm American, at least in the States, if you talk about climate change, that's what people think of. But the second field is adaptation, and that is not really, that's not seeking to change or address climate change itself, but the effects. How do we manage the situation? How do we cope with the greater frequency and severity of disasters? As climate change progresses, this has huge implications for farming and farming systems and agriculture and rural livelihoods. And that in turn will probably lead to greater rural to urban migration, things like that. These are big, complicated problems that we have to deal with because of climate change, but they're not actually changing climate change itself. This is an important distinction in these two programs, or two programming columns, and we'll come back to these a bit. And then what is a rights-based approach? Again, seeking to empower everyone so that they can exercise their full spectrum of human rights. This goes beyond just social, political, and cultural rights towards economic, social, beyond just political and civil rights towards economic, social, and cultural rights, to have a decent livelihood, et cetera, et cetera. But really, rights-based approaches to development programming usually take an empowerment approach over a service delivery approach, and try to address who has power, who doesn't, who has rights, everyone, and where does responsibility lie in how to achieve these aims. So these are both climate change and rights-based approaches are, like I said, increasingly used in proposals, in reports, in programming, but it's just not that clear sometimes what it means. Usually adaptation is relating to economic social rights, often wrapped up with livelihoods and rural livelihoods. Not exclusively, but a lot of climate change adaptation programming is rural livelihoods, especially in farming systems, because agriculture is so sensitive to even slight variations in climate, or for that matter, in extreme weather events. And there's a sense that we need to move from just throwing around these big words and these big terms and these principles and unpack that a bit and see what it means. And if you're an NGO submitting that proposal and you say you've got a rights-based approach, it should mean a specific collection of things. And what is that? What are these links? Okay, just pretty much cover this. So these issues are being met with a lot of, I think, globally as well as in Cambodia, recognition, confusion, skepticism, and caution. Recognition that climate change is going to be harder and harder to ignore, and the linkages between, I think, rights-based approaches and climate change. For example, disasters do not affect everyone equally, right? The poorest and the most vulnerable are the ones who live on the most marginal lands. They live on the floodplains. They have the poorest quality housing. Disasters do not have uniform impact. Disasters affect different people differently. And those are embedded in issues around inequality. Another complicated factor is that healthy ecosystems are best equipped to actually get through climate change, right? The more an ecosystem is already under stress, the more likely it is to collapse, right? A good example is the fish stocks in the Tonle Sap. Fish are very, very sensitive to certain climatic changes, including, water levels and stuff, but also temperature has a huge effect on their reproductive cycles. The fish stocks in the Tonle Sap are more likely to maintain high levels of fish if it's not already under stress from pollution and drams and all of these other things. So there's actually a big link between healthy environmental systems and ecosystems that are healthy and rural livelihoods and climate and adaptation as well. But there's also a lot of confusion in some quarters and skepticism whether or not any of this rhetoric is going to mean anything. And a lot of caution about the implications, about the political implications of what this would mean. And I'll come back to that later. So, 4 basic principles of a right-based approach according to various UN documents. Participation, opportunity, transparency, accountability, in non-discrimination. What does this mean for, say, climate change programming? In Cambodia, my colleague Ian Christopoulos and I went around and we interviewed, I think we did 25 separate interviews with NGOs, government agencies, local experts. There's a professor at RUPP, etc. We interviewed quite a lot of people. But the focus was on civil society organizations, NGOs, and also community-based organizations, or CBOs. And asked them about if they had any commitments to rights-based approaches to climate change. What were they? And how did it what did that mean in practice? And we found various specific groupings of NGOs, which took different approaches. And one of the things that we found was that the climate change programming here is very, very, very siloed. It's, the agriculture people are here, and the forest management people are here, and the legal human rights people are here, and they're talking to each other, but they're not really programming together very well. And particularly, there is a lot of avoidance of difficult questions and politically sensitive questions. For example, as I mentioned, a lot of the issues in villages and with farming and agriculture today are linked not only to climate change, but also to more immediate environmental problems in Cambodia around land concessions, deforestation, timber, poor natural resource management in general. One of the uncomfortable things we found was that there is a tendency to blame things on climate change that are actually mixed up with deforestation, which is more current and more proximate, but it's politically difficult to address. And so it's easy to say every flood or everything is climate change, but actually deforestation has huge environmental effects. It changes the water levels, compromises agriculture in lots of ways. So anyways, these organizations included conservation and natural resource management. Most of these did not take rights-based approaches and often avoided political issues and focused specifically on, we work with this waterway, this particular river, or we have some protected area in Mondulkiri, and we just focus on this. And they don't really engage with the development organizations very much, and they usually take a soft advocacy approach. And then we have lots of development agencies, and these are the ones engaged in things like agriculture and water resource management, livelihoods. And they usually have a service delivery or orientation. And while there is recognition about larger issues outside of their specific scope, they tend to stay within the sector that they work in. they're an agriculture agency, they deal with the agriculture only. And while there's a lot of adoption of, say, particular technologies or techniques that might improve drought resilience or something like that, they're very reluctant to address questions like deforestation because that's a different sector. So they're staying within their sector and often focusing on technology transfer and not always very effectively on the underlying social, economic, and political drivers of climate vulnerability. Then we have human rights and legal services organizations. These are the ones who are taking the hard advocacy approach. These are the Licados of the world, etc. However, they're also siloed in their own way insofar as they focus on legal issues and legal cases and legal matters, and as opposed to a broad-based empowerment approach to climate change programming or climate change rights or environmental rights. They tend to focus on identifying legal cases and pursuing them in the courts. And climate change adaptation doesn't really fit that very well. So if it gets mixed up with a land case, for example, if there's a big economic land concession, they'll do that because that can be a legal challenge. But if the result of that economic land concession is all of this environmental problems that affecting neighboring communities, they tend not to because it's not such a clean and neat and clear-cut legal case. The other thing is that they often take a hard advocacy approach, and some of the development agencies involved with the soft advocacy approaches don't want to be associated. So there's everybody kind of keeping each other at arm's length. We have humanitarian groups that do emergency relief, disaster work, usually around floods. Floods every year here. And we found one thing we found that was very interesting and very different from the Kenyan case that was also in the case study, is that a lot of the relief agencies were fairly poorly networked into the climate change program. And part of that seems to be some specific personality issues within some very specific people in the government. But also that the climate change strategy and policy that's led by the government emphasizes a green growth model. And while there are policies and strategies and some networks on disaster management, there's an odd sort of separation between the disaster management and the climate change. Not that disaster management isn't there within the climate change work, but it's kind of marginalized. It's not the emphasis. We found this completely opposite from Kenya and quite surprising. And then we have the CSO networks. These are the umbrella groups, the climate change, the National Climate Change Committee or the NGO forums. And then CBOs and constituencies groups. This is one of the most interesting things that's been happening in Cambodia in the past 2 or 3 years, is the rise of increasingly vocal and forthright community-based organizations. In constituency groups, what I mean by that is it could be people who are living in a particular location who are working together on a particular issue, or things like fishermen's associations, associations of people involved in a particular trade or livelihood or something. And they are increasingly standing up and taking sometimes some very confrontational positions around issues, particularly fishing. But we're finding these groups, like I said, silos, not quite talking to each other. And while there's a lot of agreement that, yes, it would be much better if we all took a more coherent and comprehensive stand, for example, around the forest issues, when we talk to them about how they approach advocacy and how they approach their strategic plans and their vulnerability analysis, there's then a tendency to just stay within your own sector, your own safe spot, and focus on technology transfer. That's very frequently been the case. Technology transfers things like green cook stoves or a new water pump or something like that, and where things are really coming around full circle, though, is the issues around forests and land, which, when we talk to people individually, everyone agrees this is the biggest problem, but there's quite a lot of hesitation to actually address it because it's politically sensitive. But I think with the rights-based approach, which specifically addresses the participation, transparency, accountability, and power dynamics, it's going to be increasingly difficult to avoid these issues and avoid these questions, and I don't know where that's going to go. Does anybody have any questions so far? So we know Cambodia is one of the highest countries in the world on the climate vulnerability lists. And it is both highly vulnerable because of certain environmental factors, but also because of high levels of poverty and the flooding. Cambodia is actually the #1 country in the entire world for the percentage of the population affected by flooding. However, one of the differences, though, is that Cambodia doesn't usually get the extreme disasters. It doesn't get the Philippines, the typhoons that hit the Philippines. Cambodia is fairly safe from extreme disasters, but it's the central lowlands are a floodplain. So there's very frequent disasters, but not severe. But some of the things that place Cambodia at high risk for climate vulnerability are high levels of poverty and the fact that 80% of the population is rural and 65% works primarily in agriculture. So this dependence on small-scale agriculture and fishing, and both fish stocks and agriculture are in turn extremely sensitive to both gradual changes in overall climate as well as in increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events like droughts and floods. And this state, as I mentioned, Cambodia this is such a great place. I love it. But one of the interesting things from the policy level in Cambodia, this was one of the first least developed countries to really adopt a strong and coherent climate change policy framework. It's gotten tons of money from all sorts of, the Climate Investment Fund and the World Bank and all of that. And it's actually been seen as a leader among least developed countries in having an early policy framework and one of the most developed and advanced ones. However, as I said, there is an emphasis on green growth. With an emphasis on the growth. And a lot of the civil society organizations and including the farmers and the fishers and the community-based organizations are increasingly speaking up that the benefits are not trickling down from the green growth model, first of all, and that secondly, the model is avoiding the difficult issues that are really affecting their lives and their livelihoods. So, are these concepts linked? Yes and no. I mean, they're linked, but how are they understood here? Many people don't understand the links. Climate change, human rights, where's the legal case, that kind of thing. But the land and the land concessions debate is what is really increasingly pulling these together, because farmers need land tenure security, and they need a good farming environment. And those are both very linked and very wrapped up in the land issues. Fisheries are where the civil society challenges to, I think, dominant development paradigms and policies are happening. We have more and more fisher groups taking more and more confrontational stances, challenging issues, particularly around law enforcement. A lot of what's kind of going on here is that we have some wonderful, wonderful policies in place, but very weak law enforcement. And this is particularly around natural resource management, like fishing and logging. Very poor law enforcement. And the fisher groups, and these are not necessarily big, NGOs in Phnom-Penh, but out in the villages, it's the people who depend on fish who are increasingly taking the leadership role in challenging problems, and particularly problems of law enforcement. And nobody quite knows what to do about this conflict of interest about the natural resource management. We have new laws coming in, the environmental impact assessment law. There's more social and environmental components that must be looked at to get a land concession, things like that. But the state, the overall direction of the state is ambiguous, and it contradicts itself. And that is a really key tension, I think, right now in governance in Cambodia. But then the ones who are taking the more strong human rights stands are, again, they're focused on sort of immediate legal cases that are happening today and not quite looking at some of the big picture. And I think I've covered most of these points already. Let me just check what time it is. Again, the green growth emphasis, but one of the odd things that we're seeing here is climate justice and mitigation used as arguments to promote maladaptation. What does that mean, right? You're all like going, what is that? I'm like, this is really important. Maladaptation is a word used in climate change programming to refer to two things. One is programs and policies that are designed to address climate change or climate change adaptation that actually don't. Either they're ineffective or they actually cause harm to either the environment or to people. An example is there are certain coastal infrastructure things that might be good for this particular strip of beach, but cause larger environmental damage. Another case, and this is the one that's always cited in the literature, was there was a policy in Mozambique to improve people's adaptive capacities and reduce their vulnerability to disaster. And there were a lot of poor people living on a floodplain, so they just moved them, but they just got dumped somewhere, without alternative place to live. So yeah, they're not vulnerable to floods anymore, but this is a good example of what not to do, right? You don't just remove people from the floodplain if they don't have anywhere else to go. So that's an extreme example of maladaptation, but it actually happened on a large scale in Mozambique one year, so it's always cited. So what we're seeing here in Cambodia, and I mentioned this previously, is shifting the blame from immediate environmental problems towards climate change as a means to avoid dealing with the immediate problem. There are lots of concerns about climate change and the fish stocks in the Tonle Sap, but there are also other concerns that are immediate, that are urgent, and they're more localized in terms of who is responsible for them. Because by climate change being a global problem, it's because Europe and the Americans are emitting so many greenhouse gases. It's not linked to the fact that we're not enforcing fishing regulations and the use of the electric fishing stuff. You know what I mean? And so normally there's rhetoric and discussion around climate justice, around the Americans burn up so much gases so that they should pay more for cleaning up the air and the environment. That's a climate justice argument. But what we kind of have here is a shifting of the blame of sometimes immediate local environmental issues that are not climate change, but by calling it climate change, you can avoid responsibility for addressing it. And that's a very big concern. And it's not one that people know how to deal with very well. And it's also wrapped up in law enforcement, which is, again, a lot of NGO networks going to NGO forum meetings and putting their input into policies, but the policies are not being implemented and the laws are not being enforced. And when the local fisher group and the local farmer groups who are engaged in things like community forestry are encountering issues, they're not really in much of a position to enforce the law. Emphasis on public policy formation. Another interesting question here is around discrimination, and discrimination is usually cited as one of the core principles for rights-based approaches. We saw a lot of commitments to gender equality and sometimes some very good programming aimed at strengthening women's livelihoods or working particularly with indigenous peoples in the Northeast to try to get better recognition of communal land rights and things like that. There were commitments, but there was often a bit of confusion as to how to actually go about addressing these issues in a specific way. And while there was some recognition, like I said, about women and indigenous peoples, there are other groups that are also marginalized that nobody seems to be touching with a 10-foot pole, and that includes the Chams and especially the Vietnamese. This is actually a huge programming gap. In some cases, there's some things that make sense. Like my understanding is that the Cham fishermen or the Cham farmers have the same practices as their Khmer neighbors. So it's not like they have different kinds of farming practices and food and things like that. So in comparison with our other case study in Kenya, where different ethnic groups ate different food and farmed different things differently. Cambodia is more homogenous in that sense. But there are a lot of issues around marginalization of minorities and not recognizing their rights, and particularly issues around the Vietnamese that are not being addressed. And so where does this bring us? What does a human rights-based approach, perspective or lens, mean here? It would probably mean confronting this split between safe adaptation, greens cook stoves for everybody, and sensitive mitigation, because mitigation means protecting forests. Mitigation means better natural resource management than we have. And that is sensitive, and so most of the agencies are separating that, but a rights-based approach would bring those together, actually. It would mean overcoming this reluctance to go beyond technical fixes. What I mean by that is, okay, let's take a farming community. And you might have a particular technology, the green cook stove, or a new seed of rice or something like that, that is a specific intervention that you can train people on and they can adopt it, and it will improve their capacity to withstand drought, for example. And these technical interventions are really, really important, and they're critical, and they can be transformative. But the other issue is that the people who are most vulnerable to disasters and to climate change are the ones who are the poor and the most marginalized. And sometimes these technical fixes don't actually address power and inequality. For example, in Cambodia, most agriculture is rain-fed. Most farmers are smallholders practicing rain-fed agriculture. So if you have a technical solution to climate change that focuses on irrigation systems and irrigation canals and irrigation channels, that actually primarily benefits commercial farmers and plantations over smallholders. And so while it's great, and that might be a really great strategy for maintaining Cambodia's rice supply, rice yields on an annual basis, etc., it doesn't actually, it's not an inclusive model because the poorest and the most vulnerable are not benefiting directly from that because it's not linked into to the kind of agriculture that they practice. Yeah, addressing the siloization of the human rights agencies. The human rights agencies and the development agencies kind of not really talking to each other and being a little bit afraid to talk to each other sometimes. The community-based organizations, the constituency groups, the rabble-rouser fishers, they're really speaking up more and more and more. And many of the NGOs in Cambodia take a sort of a bit of a patronizing top-down service-oriented approach of speaking for the poor and the uneducated. And that's really changing. That's changing, and it's changing fast. And I think that's a very new factor on the civil society landscape here. And then if we're going to apply these human rights-based principles, new strategies and perspectives on how we design our programs, how we think about them, how we think about climate change, and linking the different things together. Overall, and this is the conclusions back to, you know, the Danish military for some unknown reason. But it was really more of a Danita. Human rights-based approaches can be used to clarify who is responsible for climate change adaptation, what their duties are, that national governments have responsibilities to address climate change, but if they lack the capacity to do so, then we need to combine advocacy and capacity building together to address the bigger issues, not just the smaller ones. It's civil society's role to be holding the governments and the donors accountable that these policies are being implemented, and that human rights perspectives and human rights mandate can be a platform for this kind of advocacy. And finally, that there's no magic bullet here. There's no magic bullet. If we put all this language into all of our trainings and all of our proposals, we need to have them actually implemented and followed through on in a meaningful way to support adaptation and economic development. And here's the two reports that we wrote. They're both on the internet. I was going to have a stack of these sent in from Denmark, and the person who was going to send them got sick and it didn't happen. So I don't have reports for you, I'm sorry. But I do have links to the reports. They're on the Danish Institute for International Studies website. And we have a policy brief, and then this one's about 75 pages, a full report. So, any questions?
Well, thank you, Colleen, for your nice presentation. So I think we have 20 or 30 minutes for questions. So please give your question.
Just not so much a question